What if I told you there was one war that didn't just change borders? It changed America itself. Not just its military, not just its economy, but its identity. Before this war, the United States was powerful. After it, it became something else entirely. A global force, a superpower, a nation the world would never look at the same way again. Tonight, we're breaking down the war that redefined American power and why its impact still shapes your life today. If you care about American history, strategy, and the forces that shape global power, hit like and subscribe, because we go deep. Let's begin. Before the war that redefined American power, the United States was strong, but it was not yet dominant. In the early decades of the 20th century, America was rising. Its factories were growing. Its cities were expanding. Its economy was becoming one of the largest in the world. There was confidence. There was ambition. But there was also distance. Distance from Europe's rivalries. Distance from old empires. Distance from the idea of permanent global leadership. For many Americans, the nation's strength was meant to protect the homeland, not police the world. The memory of past conflicts still lingered. Families had sacrificed. Soldiers had returned changed. There was pride, yes, but also caution. The country believed in opportunity, in industry, in building, in progress, not in ruling the globe. At this point, global power still revolved around European empires. Britain commanded the seas. France held vast territories. Other powers projected influence through colonies and alliances that stretched across continents. The United States was powerful, but not central. Its military, though capable, was not built for worldwide dominance. Its foreign policy leaned toward restraint. The prevailing belief was simple. Prosperity at home mattered more than entanglement abroad. And yet, beneath that surface calm, something was shifting. Industrial capacity was growing at a breathtaking pace. American factories were producing steel, oil, automobiles, machinery, at levels the world had never seen before. The economic engine was roaring. The question was not whether America had power. The question was whether it would ever fully use it. At the same time, tensions were rising overseas. Alliances hardened. Competition intensified. Political instability spread across continents. Storm clouds gathered beyond American shores. Still, many believed the oceans were protection enough. There was a sense of security in geography. Two vast oceans, friendly neighbors, a booming economy. Why step into conflicts that were not ours? But power does not exist in isolation. Trade connected markets. Diplomacy connected governments. Security connected nations in ways that could not always be controlled. Even without direct involvement, the ripple effects of global instability began to touch American interests. Economic ties meant that turmoil abroad could shake confidence at home. Political shifts overseas could reshape alliances. The world was becoming more interconnected, faster than many realized. And yet, public opinion remained cautious. Debates filled newspapers and town halls. Should America take a larger role in global affairs? Or should it preserve its independence from foreign struggles? The nation stood at a crossroads without fully understanding it. Because while America hesitated, the scale of global conflict was growing. Technology had changed warfare. Industry had changed logistics. Nations were preparing not just armies, but entire economies for confrontation. If the United States were ever pulled in, it would not be a limited engagement. It would be total. At this moment in history, America was like a sleeping giant of industry, wealthy, productive, confident, but not yet transformed into the kind of force that could reshape the world order. The military was respectable, but not unmatched. The economy was powerful, but not yet weaponized for global conflict. The political system valued debate and restraint over aggressive expansion. There was no clear blueprint for global dominance. And that is what makes this moment so critical. Because before the turning point, America still had a choice. It could remain a powerful nation among many. It could protect its prosperity and avoid deeper involvement. It could continue rising quietly. Or it could step into a role no nation had ever fully occupied before. What changed was not just strategy. It was identity. Before the war, America saw itself as strong, independent, and prosperous, but not responsible for shaping the entire international system. After the war, that perception would never be the same. But to understand that transformation, we have to understand this tension first. A nation confident, yet cautious, powerful, yet restrained, growing, yet not fully aware of what it was becoming. And then, everything shifted. For years, the United States watched from a distance. Headlines arrived from overseas. Reports of escalation, alliances forming, nations mobilizing. It felt serious, but still far away. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not a gradual shift, not a quiet policy debate, but a single event that cut through hesitation and forced a decision. In an instant, distance no longer felt like protection. The shock moved fast. Across radios, across newspapers, across dinner tables. People who had gone to work that morning thinking about ordinary concerns suddenly felt something heavier settle into the air. Uncertainty. Questions rose immediately. How did this happen? Are we prepared? What happens next? The event did more than damage assets or threaten interests. It pierced the assumption that America could remain insulated from global turmoil. Geography no longer felt like a shield. Oceans no longer felt wide enough. The emotional shift was immediate. Where there had been debate, there was now urgency. Where there had been division, there was unity. Where there had been caution, there was resolve. Lines formed outside recruitment offices. Factories that once produced consumer goods began preparing for something larger. Political leaders, who had argued over degrees of involvement, now spoke with clarity about national mobilization. But beneath the unity, there was a quieter question. Were we ready? America had strength. It had industry. It had manpower. But transforming those assets into coordinated global power would require speed and scale unlike anything the country had attempted before. Mobilization began almost overnight. Production schedules expanded. New facilities were commissioned. Research intensified. Transportation networks were reorganized to support movement of troops and equipment. What had been a civilian economy started shifting toward total commitment. Families adjusted to uncertainty. Communities held meetings. Churches filled. Flags appeared in windows. The country was not just preparing for conflict. It was redefining its priorities. The tone of the nation changed. Speeches became firmer. Messaging became direct. The idea of limited engagement disappeared. If America was stepping in, it would step in fully. And that is where the real transformation began. The event that forced action did not simply pull the United States into war. It forced the country to confront its own potential, to decide whether it would respond cautiously or decisively. History shows that some nations react defensively, others retreat. But in this moment, the United States accelerated. Shipyards expanded. Aircraft production surged. Training camps multiplied. The scale of preparation stunned observers around the world. What had looked like hesitation only months earlier now looked like determination. The question shifted from will America act to how far will America go? Allies watched closely. Rivals recalculated. The balance of power began to adjust even before major campaigns unfolded. Because industrial capacity, once activated, does not move quietly. The psychological shift may have been the most important change of all. America no longer saw itself as a distant observer of global events. It saw itself as a decisive participant. And that shift carried weight. Mobilization unified the country, but it also locked in momentum. Once factories were converted and forces deployed, there was no easy return to the previous posture. The nation had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about isolated incidents. It was about direction. The catalyst had forced a choice, and America chose engagement on a scale that would alter its future permanently. But action alone does not create dominance. What came next, the transformation of industry into overwhelming capability, would redefine not only the outcome of the conflict, but America's position in the world. Because once the machine of production truly began to move, it did not just support a war. It began reshaping global power itself. Topic 3. Industrial power becomes global power. Once the decision was made, everything accelerated. Factories that once built cars began producing armored vehicles. Assembly lines that made appliances shifted to aircraft parts. Steel, oil, rubber, aluminum. Every resource found new purpose. The transformation was not gradual. It was immediate. relentless. America had always been an industrial giant, but now, that strength was being directed with precision, coordinated, measured, expanded beyond anything the world had seen before. The numbers alone were staggering. Production multiplied month after month. Shipyards launched vessels at record speed. Aircraft rolled out in waves. Equipment moved from blueprint to battlefield faster than rivals believed possible. This was not just participation. This was scale. And scale changes everything. What made the difference was not a single breakthrough. It was the combination of workforce, innovation, logistics, and coordination. Millions stepped into new roles. Men and women filled factories. Engineers redesigned processes. Managers reorganized systems to eliminate delay. Time became the most valuable currency. How fast could a ship be built? How quickly could a plane be assembled? How efficiently could supplies move across oceans? Each improvement compounded the next. Production curves bent upward. The pace intensified. The industrial machine began to operate at full capacity. And the world noticed. Allies depended on American output. Supplies flowed outward in massive quantities. Equipment, fuel, food. Support extended far beyond national borders. Industrial strength became diplomatic leverage. Rivals faced a new reality. They were not just fighting soldiers. They were competing with an economy. The difference between building thousands and building tens of thousands is not incremental. It is strategic. It shapes outcomes before battles even begin. But industrial expansion was only part of the story. Innovation surged alongside production. Research laboratories accelerated development. New technologies emerged. Communication improved. Transportation systems adapted. Coordination between government and private industry deepened. The nation was no longer simply reacting. It was optimizing. The psychological impact mattered as much as the material one. Confidence grew as output expanded. Reports of production milestones reinforced belief that the country could sustain long-term engagement. Momentum fed morale. And momentum creates dominance. Because when a nation can outproduce its competitors consistently, it shifts the balance of power. Endurance becomes an advantage. Resources become strategy. Logistics become leverage. What began as mobilization was becoming transformation. The economy itself was evolving. Employment surged. Infrastructure expanded. Regions that had been quiet became industrial hubs. Skills developed during this period would influence American capability for decades. But there was a deeper shift taking place. America was discovering that its greatest weapon was not only military strength, it was industrial organization, the ability to coordinate vast resources quickly, to align public will with private capacity, to scale production without losing momentum. This realization changed perception. At home, the country began to see what it was capable of achieving when unified. Abroad, observers recalculated American potential, no longer cautious, no longer distant, capable of sustaining global operations at unmatched levels. The phrase arsenal of democracy was more than rhetoric. It described a structural advantage, a system that could supply allies, equip forces, and maintain pressure over time. And once the system reached full speed, it did not slow easily. The war was still unfolding. Campaigns were still underway. But something larger was already becoming clear. America was not just contributing to victory. It was shaping the conditions for it. Industrial power had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply economic strength. It had become geopolitical influence. And when the conflict eventually ended, the factories would not disappear. The infrastructure would not vanish. The capacity would remain, which raised a new question. If a nation can build at this scale, if it can organize at this speed, if it can project resources across oceans without pause, what role will it play once the fighting stops? Because by this point, America was no longer just fighting a war. It was redefining what power looked like in a modern world. When the war finally began to wind down, the world did not return to what it had been. It couldn't. Entire cities were damaged. Economies were exhausted. Old empires were weakened. The global balance that had defined decades of history was fractured. And in that silence after the storm, one nation stood with unmatched capacity. The United States had not only expanded its military strength, it had preserved its industrial base. It had accelerated innovation. It had built alliances that stretched across continents. The question was no longer whether America was powerful. The question was what it would do with that power. Across Europe and parts of Asia, reconstruction became urgent. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Financial systems had to stabilize. Political institutions needed support. The scale of recovery required resources that few nations could provide. America stepped into that space, not as a distant observer, but as a central architect. Financial assistance flowed outward. Strategic partnerships deepened. Agreements were drafted to stabilize currencies and encourage trade. Institutions were formed to manage economic cooperation and prevent future instability. This was new territory. Before the war, the United States had debated involvement. After the war, it was helping shape the framework of global recovery. Military presence expanded as well. Bases were established in key regions. Security commitments were formalized. Alliances were structured not just for immediate defense, but for long-term balance. The world order was being redesigned, and America was at the center of it. But this transition did not feel dramatic in a single moment. It unfolded quietly, through conferences, through negotiations, through economic agreements that would influence decades of policy. Power shifted not only through force, but through structure. Trade routes were stabilized under new leadership. Financial systems increasingly relied on American strength. The dollar gained prominence. Markets connected more closely to American output and investment. Influence expanded without formal empire. That distinction mattered. The United States did not rule colonies in the traditional sense. Instead, it anchored systems, security systems, economic systems, diplomatic systems, and those systems shaped global behavior. Allies looked to Washington for coordination. Rivals measured their strategies against American capacity. International crises increasingly required American involvement to reach resolution. This was the birth of something unprecedented, a superpower not defined only by territory, but by reach. The military footprint extended across oceans. Naval forces patrolled distant waters. Air power connected continents. Strategic deterrence became part of global calculation. But influence was not limited to defense. American culture spread through film, music, technology, and education. Universities attracted students from around the world. Corporations expanded operations internationally. Innovation became a symbol of national identity. The war had accelerated more than victory. It had accelerated visibility. And with visibility came expectation. When crises emerged, eyes turned toward the United States. When economies faltered, markets reacted to American signals. When alliances required coordination, American leadership became central. This new role brought opportunity. It also brought responsibility, because maintaining global influence requires consistency. It requires resources. It requires decisions that ripple outward beyond borders. The superpower era did not begin with a single declaration. It emerged from capability combined with circumstance, from a world in need of stability and a nation equipped to provide it. By the late 1940s and into the decades that followed, the pattern was clear. America was no longer simply one major nation among many. It was a pillar of the international system. And once that position solidified, stepping away became far more complicated than stepping forward. The war had ended, but the era it created was just beginning. An era defined by global reach, strategic alliances, financial leadership, and constant engagement. An era in which American power was no longer measured only by what it defended at home, but by what it shaped abroad. The war ended. The factories slowed. The troops returned. The headlines shifted. But the structure that had been built did not disappear. It stayed. Decades passed. Generations changed. Technology advanced. Yet the foundations laid during that turning point continued to shape the nation's path. A permanent military presence became normal. Bases across continents. Fleets in distant waters. Alliances that required constant coordination. What began as mobilization evolved into long-term commitment. Defense planning became continuous. Readiness became expectation. The idea that America would respond to global crises became part of international assumption. And assumption carries weight. Budgets reflected it. Strategy reflected it. Foreign policy reflected it. The United States was no longer reacting to isolated events. It was managing a role. Economic influence followed the same pattern. Global trade routes relied on stability. Financial systems connected through American markets. The dollar became a central reference point in international exchange. When American markets moved, the world felt it. This level of integration did not exist before that war. It was built in its aftermath. Innovation, too, carried the imprint of that era. Research accelerated during wartime continued into peacetime. Technology developed for conflict found civilian applications. Aerospace, computing, communication. Industries expanded from foundations laid during mobilization. The mindset shifted permanently. Large-scale coordination between government, industry, and research institutions became standard. The ability to mobilize resources quickly did not fade. It became part of national capacity. Culturally, the ripple effects spread even further. American film, music, brands, universities, and ideas reached audiences far beyond its borders. Influence extended without direct control. Visibility became soft power. But there is another side to long shadows. Global leadership demands constant engagement. Strategic decisions carry worldwide consequences. Commitments require maintenance. Influence invites challenge. Every generation since has inherited that reality. Some have questioned it. Some have defended it. Some have tried to redefine it. But none have been able to ignore it, because the war that redefined American power did more than elevate the nation's position. It embedded responsibility into its identity. The expectation that America will act. The assumption that it will lead. The belief that its choices shape global direction. Those ideas were not inevitable. They were constructed through mobilization, through industrial transformation, through post-war architecture, through decades of sustained involvement. Today, when global markets fluctuate, when alliances convene, when crises emerge, the framework built in that era still operates beneath the surface. Invisible to some, obvious to others, persistent to all. And that brings us to the quiet question that lingers. Did the war simply strengthen America? Or did it permanently change what America is? Because once a nation becomes central to global stability, stepping back is never simple. Influence reshapes identity. Responsibility reshapes strategy. Power reshapes expectation. The legacy is not only measured in military capacity or economic scale. It is measured in presence. Presence in negotiations. Presence in deterrence. Presence in reconstruction. Presence in innovation. The long shadow stretches forward, touching decisions made today. And perhaps that is the most lasting transformation of all. The war ended years ago, but the era it created continues. America stands not just as a country within a system, but as a defining force of that system. And as history moves forward, the question is no longer how the war changed American power. It is how that power continues to shape the world, quietly, consistently, and in ways that are still unfolding. The turning point has passed. The legacy remains.